Drama of Truth, with your host, Father Vincent Michelli of the Society of Jesus, and Dr. William Mara, Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University. Today's program, Atheism as Humanism.
Welcome once again to the Drama of Truth program. If you recall, in the last program, we spoke about a strange condition in our times, the loss of a taste and a love for transcendental truths of metaphysical nature, of revelation. And we said that this disease, this lack of love of truth, was founded in a loss of faith in God. And we mentioned that even religion has more or less become discredited. It's reduced to being a personal experience, a thing which is evanescent, volatile, variable, and therefore many people dismiss it as not being of very great importance. Now, St. Augustine tells us, and possibly he could put it best to give us the reason for such a program, namely that he says that every social, moral, or political problem at its depth has a connection, a causal connection with man's belief or lack of belief in God, with man's care or carelessness about his relationship to God. Perhaps the psalmist put it even more succinctly in poetry when he sang the song saying, "Unless God builds the house, they labor in vain who build it." And this is a truth that concerns families, nations, and even the church itself, all of which organizations today are in deep spiritual crisis. Today our subject will be Atheism as Humanism. And perhaps, Bill, can you give us some of your reflections on this topic?
Right, Father. You know, when you say you're an atheist, immediately your opponent gets his hackles up, and I think you could lose a lot of votes at first, so that for the most part, the typical atheists today don't call themselves atheists. We have some brave, honest souls who do, but the key word, the code word today is humanist. And who could be against your being a humanist? That seems to imply that you are for man, and in fact it is true that the typical humanist is for man. But I think we ought to make it clear from the beginning that the modern humanist, the so-called secular humanist, is for man because he's against God. And I'd just like to read something about humanism from those who should know. The masters of the humanists are they put out a publication called The Humanist. In 1933, they came out with a manifesto, and the most famous man signing the manifesto was John Dewey, and we know about John Dewey. In 1973, 40 years later, they came out with a second manifesto, and I'd like to read a few lines to show the audience that we're not talking about paper tigers, we're talking about something real. The manifesto says, as in 1933, humanists still believe that traditional theism, especially faith in the prayer-hearing God, assumed to love and care for persons, to hear and understand their prayers, and to be able to do something about them, this is an unproved and outmoded faith. And finally, in the end of this Manifesto 2, which was published 4 years ago, we have almost the keynote, I think, of our program today. Too often, traditional faiths encourage dependence rather than independence, obedience rather than affirmation, fear rather than courage. But we humanists can discover no divine purpose or providence for the human species. While there is much that we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are or will become. And here's their famous line, "No deity will save us, we must save ourselves." And it seems to me, therefore, that we've always had atheism. The Bible, the psalmist has said 2,000 years ago more, the fool has said in his heart there is no God. So that we have atheism is not a surprise. But I think you were saying to me before the program that the original contribution of modern atheism is precisely this humanism.
Yes, I would say that perhaps, Bill, you might call it the charismatic magnetic aspect of modern humanism is the fact that God is represented as being the one who prevents man from developing his marvelous powers of intellect and of creative genius. And therefore, when one denies God, one is liberating man from the straitjacket of being held back from creating his own world. Therefore, his mind is being liberated to think the thoughts he wants to think, say whatever he wants to say, write whatever he wants to write. There seems to be the implied accusation against God that God puts limitations on man's thinking, on man's loving, on man's project for life. And so humanism is seen as a marvelous liberation of man. And therefore, the great humanists today look at themselves as revolutionaries against God, who is the imaginary tyrant who keeps man in slavery, and against religion, which is that system of beliefs and doctrines oriented towards God, which tend to keep man down in bondage, while those who create the system, whether they be economic overlords or religious overlords, use man for their own aggrandizement and advancement. This, of course, immediately, in a sense, admits that God exists, because what they're doing is they're fighting some sort of a being out there whom they say has tyrannized over man and put man into slavery. So you see, the very fervor with which the humanists fight against God is a negative testimony to God's existence as a spiritual and supernatural being.
Now, we want to look over, we're going to make a general survey this program about certain humanists, atheistic humanists, and what their gripe is about God. As you say, they seem to come out strong and say, I want to live, and God is somehow enchaining me. God is my rival. God is my problem. So let's begin with Marx. How did Marx consider God the rival of a real humanism?
Well, Marx said this, that religion is the opium of the people, which means this. God, the idea of God and the religion built up about it, was meant to keep the ordinary person sort of half asleep intellectually, and as a working man, especially as a working man, exploit him and keep him down to the overlords. Now, if we can loosen the genius of the ordinary working man and let that flourish, then man will create himself. He'll create a much better world. He'll get rid of exploitation in economics. He'll get rid of ignorance. He'll get rid of all forms of injustice. So Marx says that God created in man a form of resentment, a spirit of alienation. Man was considered to be a fallen creature, and therefore he was only a pilgrim in this life. There was nothing, he should not concentrate on bettering this world. He's made for a future life, so he looks for pie in the sky, as Marx says, rather than creating his own kingdom here on earth in which he betters his fellow man's life as a community, both socially, economically, educationally, and even, for example, on the score of liberty, a greater liberty. So Marx accuses, he doesn't try to, he says, I've never attempted to disprove God's existence. Feuerbach did that for me. All I want to do is get the idea of God out of men's minds and souls. Once I do that, then man becomes his own God, his own creator, and the universe he creates will be the best possible universe for him. He'll arrive at the classless society in the future in which everybody will be equal, everybody will be liberated, everybody will have a fine standard of living, and there'll really be no alienated guilt complex.
Now, the typical Jew, the typical Christian, both of whom accept the Old Testament, say, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and of course God created mankind as the crowning instance of earthly creation. But Marx seems to especially attack this notion of God the Creator, and you say he opposes man's labor?
Yes, see, the working man is really the one who creates himself. See, God the Creator, Marx looks at as a barrier to man's expression of himself and finding of himself. As long as he's a totally dependent creature on some other being who's superior to him, who gives him his being, his existence, and his powers to act, and then, of course, he can't express himself. Once you get rid of the notion of creation, so Marx says, of course, that man, matter, and motion have been here where there's no explanation for them. They've been eternal, and they're working their way out, and man is the highest expression of matter and motion, evolving to this state of perfection, conscious perfection. So once you get rid of a God that you're totally dependent on, then man is set free to create himself. In other words, Marx does not want a human nature which is made in the image and likeness of God, because that makes him a slave. He wants a human nature made in the image and likeness of man himself. Therefore, he, with his own creative powers, creates his own being, his own activities, his own goals, his own projects, his own society. So the barrier to this marvelous project, which was God and religion, has to be destroyed before man can be liberated to express himself.
Now, we've been talking about Marx, who lived about 130 years ago, and I think we find out how often his ideas are still in the air today, but in reality they are a bit old. He had a contemporary in France, Pierre Proudhon, who was a social thinker, and he too had his own version of atheist humanism. Would you amplify that?
Yes, Pierre Proudhon was a socialist philosopher, and he stressed the fact that mere atheism is not enough. You have to have what he calls anti-theism. Anti-theism turns atheism into a militant attack on God. An atheist is one who says there is no God. Fine, Feuerbach did that, Marx did that, but Proudhon added a notion of zeal, a messianic thrust to atheism, which made the atheist now work for his mission to root out the idea of God in his fellow man, so that his fellow man now would be totally liberated to create his own world, create himself, create his own world. So you see, from atheism to anti-theism is a positive thrust of dynamism, a dynamic attack on religion and God, with the mission to eradicate both from the consciousness of man.
But what was Proudhon's particular gripe against religion? Did he say it was the opium of the people, or what?
Well, Proudhon again looked on religion as a form of a straitjacket against a false idea of providence. He says, for example, this is the one point he didn't like about it. He says many people will say, "Well, it's God's will that I be poor. So what's the use of me trying to better myself? Scripture says, the poor you will have always with you." So a certain fatalistic approach enters into man. And instead of bettering himself, he settles down to his poverty and becomes sort of lazy and used to his poverty and looks for his betterment in the next life. So Proudhon said religion, with its false idea of God's providence being in control of everything, tends to induce in man a fatalistic resignation with his helpless lot, and this is a form of degrading man.
You know, now that's on the part, say, of the poor person, and the rich people find that scripture rather helpful too.
Oh yes, for example, the other thing that Proudhon condemns is that the rich say, well, it must be God's blessing. If you have become rich, that's because God is on your side. The old Puritan ethic that the businessman, if he was doing well and making riches, and it didn't make any difference that he was not giving fair wages, it was God's will. The Calvinists said that a sign of God's approval was your success in business, whereas you and I know today a sign of someone's success in business might just be that he's defrauding the laborer of his right wages, see, and cutting corners and not giving the proper working conditions to the laboring man. Now this Marx takes and blames on the true religion, whereas it should be blamed on people who were not living the true religion, but were bending the true religion, Christianity, to their own purposes.
There is this founder of sociology. I know we're going to have a special program just on him, Auguste Comte, and he went even further in this direction of a humanism, which is specifically atheistic.
Yes, Auguste Comte comes right out of the French Revolution, of course, when all of France was secularized, in fact, almost made into an atheistic state. It was illegal to baptize any of your children, and Comte says that as a child, he was an atheist. He came up with the theory of the 3 stages of man's development. And in order to make in a way, make religion look bad. He says, well, man needed religion when he was in his infancy. He went around looking for angels and devils, turning up rocks. He was weak, he was ignorant, he hadn't yet discovered his scientific prowess, and so he called on God, superstitiously, to help him. He was in his infancy, he needed that. But then slowly he grew up into his adolescence. And as he grew into his adolescence, this was his philosophical stage. He had ideas of God, but these ideas were now rinsed of all superstition. They were abstract ideas. And so man was not yet come of age, he was an adolescent, so his philosophy was still perfumed, heavily perfumed with religious thought, which he had in his infancy. But then along came the burst of man's control of the cosmos, his growth in science, the exact sciences. And he no longer needed philosophy, the perfumed ideas of God. He no longer needed superstition. Now he was man come of age. He's a scientific atheist. There is no God. He's self-sufficient unto himself now. He makes his own world, and out of technocratic, positivistic science, positivism, what you can know through experimentation, he then builds up the new world, the world of man come of age, the world of mature humanity. He established a religion, the religion of humanity, which was of humanity as a society. That's where he gets his name, sociology. He coined the name, the science sociology. And then he called his religion sociocracy. And who were the high priests in that religion? The scientists were the high priests. So that he turned men from being men of God into being men of science, and they were the high priests.
There's a familiar ring to it. I think the more we go over these thinkers of the last century, the more we realize that the 20th century simply embodies these ideas very often without even knowing it. It seems that most of our contemporaries have an amnesia of the past century, but you find this in certain theology courses, certain catechetics courses, this phrase, man has come of age, and all of a sudden we're out of our infancy, we're out of our adolescence, and that makes us qualified for what? Or allegedly for a scientific approach to God or religion.
Exactly. What happens is men don't know their history, like the death of God. That goes all the way back to Nietzsche. He 100 years ago was saying that, but they find out that it's being used today as a novel expression. Or, for example, sociological humanism. Auguste Comte had that about the time, for example, that Nietzsche was living, see? And yet people don't know their philosophy, they don't know their history, and so when they hear these, what we call God phrases, they immediately perk up and say, well, this is something new, let's look into it, you know. And of course, with their professors egging them on, they think they're going into a new world. They're not.
And it flatters people no end to be told that they have come of age. But when one looks at the human person, when one looks at the taste, the morality, the squeamishness, the pathetic way most people die, one wonders if we have in any sense come of age.
Well, that's a good point. You see, man's greatest power is his intellect. That is the light of his being. Just as Satan fell by falling in love with the brilliance of his nature and forgetting who gave him. He was the brightest of angels, Lucifer, and forgot who gave him this great and fell in love with it, and then he wasn't an atheist. He knew God existed, but his theism didn't help him because he revolted against God and fought against God and immediately lost his eternal destiny, except had an eternal destiny in hell. Well, man now, when his intellect awakens, when he hits the university level, as you were talking about last time, the village atheist, when he gets the academic gown on him and he sees what a marvelous intellect he has, he forgets where that intellect came from. And he thinks it's superstitious to bow it down before a God who is the author of his whole being. And so he becomes self-sufficient by his own brilliance. He falls in love with his own intellect. There's a certain autoerotic intellectualism that every atheist falls into. See?
I want to read something from Nietzsche himself in Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's again a typical chilling, arrogant claim which nevertheless has some method in its madness. So here he speaks, "Ye higher men, this God was your greatest danger. Only since he lay in the grave have ye again risen. Now only cometh the great noontide. Now only doth the higher man become master. Now only does the mountain of the human future work itself out progressively in history. God has died. Now do we desire the supermen to live. Who, by the way, are these higher men of Nietzsche?
These higher men of Nietzsche are an elite group of great intellectuals with strong willpower who are willing to break with all the customs of the masses. The masses, as Nietzsche says, have been corrupted by the morality of Christianity, the morality of meekness, of kindness, of brotherly love. This is all for Nietzsche a sign of weakness, and it's meant to keep the masses subservient to a wicked priesthood, which will lead and manipulate these masses according to their own will, so that they can keep them down and at the same time maintain power over them. But Nietzsche says no. The true man who will become more than man, that's what he means by superman, overman, who will become more than man, go beyond the limits of the masses, will set his own willpower above. He wrote a book, The Transvaluation of All Values, so that all of the values in truth and morality, which were already existent in a Christian milieu, should be overturned, and the Superman is an elitist group who will run against the masses' sniveling, groveling existence and live on a higher level, almost on tops of mountains, with new values, and they will be the gods of humanity.
You see, that's interesting, because the American Humanist Society, from which I quoted their manifesto, they, in a sense, are more humane in their humanism. They want the little guy to get some sort of good life, but Nietzsche just wants the genius.
Yes, Nietzsche wants the genius to get the sense. Of course, now, there is a certain also arrogance in the humanists, too, because they are an elite group. Not everybody signs those humanist manifestos. They're all bright lights in the academic world, and they are a Gnostic group. What they're telling you and me, who believe in God, is, look, we have the true knowledge of what man is. You people, poor little people, you're still superstitious, you haven't come of age. So there is an arrogance there, a Gnosticism there, which may not be as clearly expressed as Nietzsche expresses it, boldly, violently, but nonetheless it's there. And when you speak to these people, you'll see the arrogance and pride in their faces. Or if you read the Humanist magazine, it's an amazingly proud and down-the-nose written thing to the ordinary man, see? So,
right. Let's just talk a little bit about atheism and psychology, that Germany has the unlucky fate, it seems, to be the seedbed of so many of these modern movements. And we've had the irrationalists in Germany. We've had Schopenhauer and also Nietzsche, who were friends or contemporaries. But from this very hotbed of irrationalism, we had Sigmund Freud.
Yes, well, I want to mention something about Freud. In his psychology, there is a sort of a debased and a murky shadow of Nietzsche's ideas. You remember, Nietzsche had man killing God. Freud has man killing, murdering his father, his own father. And he cannot overcome the remorse of this. And he cannot return to the time before man's original sin as he attacks his father, the Oedipus complex and whatnot. And because one's father is truly dead, according to Freud, man is also incapable of commending himself for abolishing forever the father's kingdom. And so therefore Freud has a type of irrevocable, aborted Nietzschean Superman in his own theology, his own philosophy. According to Freud, the death of God is meaningless unless man becomes God himself. And therefore, Freud is another good example of the dialectics of modern atheism. Other examples can be found in Malraux and Sartre, for example, if you wish.
Well, let's get to Jean-Paul Sartre. That the only thing I know about this man is that he has corrupted 2 generations of at least Frenchmen and possibly more. He's the household word for atheism, and he's also the household word for humanism in a very strange sense.
Yes, Sartre holds, for example, that all existence is absurd. There's no God. Not only does he hold that God does not exist, he holds that God cannot exist, because he sets up a distinction of being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself has got stability and stays the same. Being for itself is dynamic. Now, the two can never get together. Absolute being in itself, stability, and absolute dynamism can never get together, since that would be God. God cannot exist. Then he goes on to show that each man has to use his own free will as his absolute power to give meaning to existence, to his life, to his projects. And you say to Sartre, well, supposing another man's meaning are different from yours, how are you going to solve the clash? He says the collective group that has the greatest number of people force their meaning of life and existence on the society, and that's going to be a form of socialism, he holds. Then we ask him, why don't you then join militant atheism? He says, because if I did that, I would then be limiting my own free will, and I say I will never join any group because my intellect, my will is absolute. Life is absurd. The minute anyone else comes into my existence, he's an enemy, he's trying to take my liberty. Therefore, I am an absolute individualist, see. So there, as we come towards the last minute of our program, we have a sort of a resume of some of these particular thinkers. They're all putting man in the center of religion, displacing God, and they're all, as a matter of fact, saying man is his own creator and he is his own maker of meaning and of his own projects. The terrible thing about this is that the humanism that they create is an inhuman humanism. Just look at the effects of these people. Millions of people killed. When man becomes his own God, he then uses his fellow man as the victims which he sacrifices on the altar, his own divine altar. And this is what we call the inhumanity of man to man. It is impossible for man to be his own God. Nietzsche tried it, and under the terrible weight of being his own God, his health broke down, and he ended up in a madhouse for the last 12 years of his life. So you see, not only does atheism hurt us intellectually and spiritually, it actually hurts us physically, politically, socially, in every dimension of human life.